Hello everybody, my name is Jenny Brown and I'm a tax partner at Streets Chartered Accountants. In this session, we are going to be covering IR35 and employment status. Now, this is quite a large area of legislation, HMRC guidelines and case law, but the aim of this session is to highlight to you the key points so that you understand any action you need to undertake. So first of all, what is IR35 and why is it important? Well, IR35 is legislation that is designed to prevent disguised employment. It applies to individuals who are working through their own limited company, and this is often referred to as their personal service company. It has been around since April 2000, but it hasn't been implemented to date with great success. Previously, the individual operating through their personal service company, who were contracted to do the work, had to determine if they fell inside or outside of IR35. Falling inside of IR35 meant that they had to put in place the deemed employment calculation and pay tax correctly. So I always think a visual aid helps, especially with an area as complex as IR35 and employment status. And what this slide encompasses is IR35 and what HMRC actually mean and what they're looking at when they're making an assessment of IR35. So as you can see, we have an individual here providing their services through their company, through their personal service company, providing services to the end client where the contract's in place between their company and the end client. What HMRC are effectively doing when they're making an IR35 assessment is they're picking up the individual's personal service company, disregarding it, putting it to one side, and looking at the relationship that exists between the individual performing the services and the end client to determine whether that is one of employment or whether they are providing services in business on their own account. So in simple terms, the curved arrow across the top of the screen is what HMRC are looking at, that hypothetical contract and that direct relationship. So what are the changes to IR35? Obviously, this session has been driven by the approaching deadline of the 6th of April 2021, where changes are coming into place for the private sector. I think the first point to clarify is terminology. It never helps when terminology keeps changing across an area that is already quite complex. And in recent years, IR35 has been referred to as off-payroll working. So if you hear the terminology off-payroll working or IR35, they mean the same thing. They mean a contract that's being performed and paid for, but it's not being paid for through the payroll. The changes that are coming into place in April are already in place across the public sector as well. So we're really seeing an alignment between the private sector and the public sector. And as you'll probably be aware, the changes coming in from the 6th of April 2021 were delayed for a year due to previously come in from 6th of April 2020. So what are these changes? Well, first of all, the most important point is the assessment rules, the key principles of IR35 and how an assessment is made have not changed. What has changed is who has the responsibility to review and determine whether an individual working through their limited company is subject to IR35. And the changes for this responsibility come twofold. They now rest with the end client being responsible for making the assessment. But if there is a separate entity who is the fee payer, then the fee payer will be responsible for the application of the tax. So it's only the responsibility to assess and apply the tax that has changed. What this change in responsibility means, especially where it is split up between a separate entity being the fee payer, is that it is more important than ever to know the chain in which you sit. So if the situation is fairly straightforward and there is an individual providing their services to an end client, the end client is the fee payer as well, and there are no other intermediaries in between, then it's fairly straightforward. However, if we have a more complex chain, as you can see on the right-hand side of the slide, This is where more care needs to be taken to understand the exact position. Who is providing services to who? And what do the contracts say? Is the individual providing their services to the intermediary, and the intermediary is making the onward supply and contract with the end client? Or is the personal service company actually providing the services to the end client, and the agency or intermediary between is simply the fee payer and supplying the labour and negotiating the contract with the end client? That's what's really important to understand if there is a more complex chain. It's really understanding who's providing services to who and what do the contracts say, and making sure that it's all very clear. Now, as mentioned, the key principles and factors which are used to assess IR35 haven't changed. And as you can see on this slide, the list there are the key primary principal areas on which an IR35 assessment is made. These are the areas that the assess tool that HMRC are looking at. And these are all areas where essentially the answers that arise from these, it's comparing, does that look and sound like someone who is in business on their own account, or does it look and sound like an employee? Does the individual providing their services through the limited company have the right to substitute and send a replacement? An employee often wouldn't have that. Are they taking financial risk on their own account? Again, an employee often wouldn't have that. They'd have an employment contract, and they'd have a notice period, and there would be a mutuality of obligation under an employment contract. The contract would be clear what would be required of that employee, and the employee would be required to fulfill it. A contract in place between an individual providing their services through a limited company might not have the same obligations. And again, the look and feel. Is the individual providing their services as part and parcel of the business? If you walked into an office and they were working from that office, would they look like and operate in the same way as many of the other employees? Are they providing their own equipment? Now, what's important to note is that it's not necessarily a tick exercise, and all of these would need to be achieved for an individual to fall outside of IR35. Obviously, there are specific sectors and specific areas where, for example, an individual might not be able to provide their own equipment. For example, if we had an industry such as the wind farm industry, and we had an individual providing their services, it's very likely, unlike a builder or carpenter, for example, that they could provide their own equipment, because this would be very specialist equipment. And in addition to that, it's very likely as a result of health and safety procedures, they simply wouldn't be able to provide their own equipment. So whilst these rules underpin the assessment, there's obviously always going to be aspects depending on sectors, health and safety requirements that need to be considered. So who do the new rules apply to? As we've mentioned, they apply to the end client and fee payer. But is there any exception? Well, yes, if the end client is deemed to be a small company, then they are exempt from applying these tests. If you are a small company, as you can see on this slide, this would mean that your annual turnover wouldn't exceed 10.2 million, the balance sheet wouldn't exceed 5.1 million, and you wouldn't have more than 50 employees. If you meet this criteria, you therefore wouldn't fall within the new responsibilities to assess those individuals in your workforce providing their services through a limited company. However, as you can see on the slide, I've sort of mentioned for now, we don't know if these rules will eventually get rolled out for all end clients. So it's very much still worth bearing in mind that these rules are there. So what are the new responsibilities? Well, the end client that engages the services, provided they're medium or large, is required to undertake the IR35 assessment before any payment is made to an individual operating through their company for services provided post the 6th of April 2021. Now, the formality is that the outcome is to be provided in the form of a status determination statement. Now, these statements must be passed on to the individual operating through their limited company. And importantly, if there is an agency or entity involved in the chain who is the fee payer then they also need to see the statement to be able to apply the correct amount of tax and know the treatment of the payments that they're making. There also needs to be an appeal process in place. After any appeal that the end client has received, they must enact on it, make the appropriate changes to their decisions, and provide an updated assessment within 45 days of the appeal being lodged. And this is the formality and where processes within a business will need to be taken on board. I cover here on this slide the CESS tool. What is the CESS tool? If you've already had some advice or looked into IR35, you'll very likely have come across this term CESS tool. So first of all, to just clear up terminology, CESS tool stands for Check Employment Status for Tax. And effectively, this is a government tool and the latest government tool that has been provided to help businesses assess the IR35 position. This would therefore form part of a business undertaking the assessment. They could use this tool. It has come under criticism for being too generic and not sector specific. And again, whilst it should be used, we'd recommend that it is used. HMRC are advising businesses to use this. And certainly, if you had a HMRC inquiry, being able to demonstrate that you'd use this tool to make your assessments or an equivalent version would stand you in good stead to demonstrate that you've taken a duty of care. But obviously it is fairly generic. So if there are any outcomes, any assessments you're making, and there is uncertainty, that's why it's important to get some advice around specific cases. Another point to just raise from a practical perspective, and again, coming back to what are HMRC actually assessing? Now, as we explained on the slide at the beginning, they're assessing that relationship between the individual and the end client. They're applying the principles that I explained, mutuality of obligation, providing own equipment. But how are they actually applying those things? Well, they're applying them to both the contract and the working practices of that individual. And that's very important to note, both the contract and the working practices. So it's important that both mirror each other. And what I mean by that is having a contract that is very much IR35 compliant is all very well. But if there is a HMRC inquiry and they review that contract, and then they review the actual working practices and the two don't tie up, then they would completely disregard the contract and focus solely on the working practices. So having a contract that reflects the actual working practices is important. So with the new requirements, what should you do? Well, if you're the end client and you aren't small, you're medium or large, and you now have to fulfill your obligations under the new requirements, I think simply put, there are possibly 4 areas that you should now focus on. So first of all, assessing your workforce. If you're a business and you are the end engager, it's important that you understand the chains, understand the workforce, and identify those individuals who are engaged through a limited company. You then need to move on to making the assessments with the appropriate application of the principles, HMRC CESS tool, and building this evidence to support the conclusion that you have reached. You then need to prepare the status determination statements themselves and make sure that for those individuals working through limited companies for you, these determinations are made by the 6th of April and passed over to them, and indeed to any agencies, so they're able to apply the correct amount of tax. It's likely that as a result of this, most businesses are going to have various new responsibilities, and they're going to want to add these additional processes to their existing procedures to make sure your relevant departments and roles within the business receive the appropriate training to be able to deal with this. What should you do if you're the individual operating through your limited company? Well, first of all, it would be ideal if you could try and understand those end clients that you're working for. Are they medium or large? And are you going to start to receive a status determination statement from any of your end clients? Because if you are, it's very likely that even though the responsibility is on them to determine your position, it's very likely you're going to want to understand that yourself first and be prepared for these statements and potentially be prepared for any discussion and appeal. If your end clients are not medium or large and they're small, then actually nothing changes for you. The onus is still on you to ensure that you apply the IR35 rules and make your own assessment. And indeed, if you fall within IR35, pay the correct amount of tax. What should you do to all end clients? So if you are small, if you're not medium or large, and you don't actually have the responsibilities coming in from the 6th of April 2021, well, you might want to review your workforce anyway. Obviously, IR35 is focused on those individuals operating through a limited company. But when you look at your workforce, in between those individuals working through their limited companies and employees, you may also have some sole traders. It's important that these don't get overshadowed and you don't forget your responsibility with sole traders. Sole traders, you always have had and will continue to have the responsibility to determine their employment status. An important point to note, referring back to the CESS tool. The CESS tool has a dual purpose. It can be used to assess IR35 for individuals operating through their own limited company, but it can also be used for sole traders to determine their employment status, because in actual fact, for individuals who are sole traders, the same assessment needs to be made, the same rules and principles need to be applied to determine, are they sole traders in business on their own account, or are they employees? And again, that responsibility always lies with the end client. So if that's something that you haven't looked at for a while, taking stock of the sole traders as well and the position there, using HMRC's tool might be timely to do that. Again, keeping up to date with the employment law and HR side of things, linking the tax status in with these, it's forever changing. And the sole trader point, employment law and HR, is heightened only further by the recent Uber case and previous Pimlico Plumbers case. So essentially, what happened with the recent Uber case is there are sole traders providing their services, and they have won the right to be termed as a worker. What this means is they are still sole traders for tax purposes, but they have rights. They have certain rights, including holiday pay and statutory pay, minimum wage rights, etc. So it's more important than ever to understand the true cost of your workforce. This slide simply highlights some of the recent cases, as mentioned, Uber. There are cases that you've no doubt seen in the media across the BBC and ITV presenters, radio presenters, with the IR35 being very much in the media in terms of success cases for HMRC, success cases for the individuals operating through their company. And I think it will be interesting to see over time where this area of legislation ends up. The fact that we have a difference in law and tax, we now have this worker for legal purposes, but we don't have an equivalent separate class for tax purposes. It's very likely that that might get aligned at some point. So I think it's very much a watch this space across employment status. So in summary, for some, the employment status for IR35 and sole traders will be very clear. However, as explained in this session, it is a very subjective area for many, and there is lots to consider in being able to make an accurate assessment. Whilst the government and HMRC have announced that there is a soft landing period of 12 months, it's crucial that you're still able to demonstrate that you've made every effort to be compliant. Not applying the rules within the 12-month period, the 12-month soft landing period is not a get out for just simply not applying the rules. If HMRC were to raise an inquiry and disagree with what you had done, provided you can demonstrate that you have been making every effort to be compliant and apply the rules, this is where the soft landing period may be beneficial for you, but you'd need to show a duty of care that you had taken on board the rules. Again, I think it's important to note it's not just what the contracts say. It's not just that they're compliant with IR35 and filed away, but actually what are the actual working practices? Have you previously made reviews? But it would be sensible to now take stock of this again and make sure the two marry up. And again, understanding the chain within which you sit and where your responsibilities lie, and especially if you're in a more complex chain where there is an intermediary, I think being really clear on who's providing services to who and exploring that is important. Hopefully this session has been helpful to cover the key points and the key changes and help you to understand what action you can take. But naturally, IR35 and the employment status is a fairly complex area and a fairly subjective area, and therefore almost every case is very different. If you have any questions, if you're the individual operating through your company, if you are the end client with a large workforce, whether you're medium or large or small, and you want to understand your workforce, please get in touch with your usual Streets contact or email us. You can see the email address on the slide attached. Thank you for listening to the IR35 and employment status session.